And then when we got 90 plus RSVPs, we thought, we'll have to change the format a bit. But you all are very welcome, and I'm really glad to have you here. Please use the chat throughout our presentation and discussion today, or feel free to jump on your camera and your voice and share it that way, share your questions or thoughts, perspectives that way. Really happy to have you all here. This is a space today that we're going to create to support people in thinking through these issues together. We know that NGO communications is evolving, and thank goodness, because there weren't just a lot of cliches at play, but I actually feel that there's some harm that's done if we continue to perpetuate stereotypes and racist tropes and all kinds of things. We are not here to really blame anybody, but we've got to talk about this stuff. And by inviting these issues to come up, we're calling for accountability that doesn't yet exist in our sector or in our wider cultures. So please allow me to be imperfect as your host today. This is hard stuff, and it's essential. So, we're not going to fix communications with the right arguments or even the right politics. We've got to, use some trial and error here and build practices in ways that don't recreate harm for people. And so we are in a change process. This is a series of online dialogues for that reason. I'm inviting you as the host into my own learning process. I'm going to share part of what I've learned, but I'm going to make mistakes as a white person. However, I know that those who are privileged within any system, we have an obligation to get our SHIT together. So that's why I've also invited two other great colleagues from the sector to share their perspectives from where they are in the system. And if they wouldn't mind putting on their cameras so folks can see them, I'm going to welcome Arby Bagios. He's a communications professional within our sector, in the nonprofit NGO sector. He's currently working with ActionAid UK, but he's worked with Save the Children and the Red Cross, the National Council for Voluntary Organizations in London, UNICEF, Oxfam. I think what I've learned from one of his bios online that I found online is he has a knack, though, for picking the best Instagram filters and hashtags. So I love that skill as a communications professional. But most importantly, Arby is the recent founder of Aid Reimagine, which hopefully he'll tell us more about. It's an initiative to help usher the evolution of the aid sector towards justice and effectiveness. I also want to introduce Catherine Nyambura. Hopefully she's online now. Her work as a Pan-African feminist and independent consultant in this sector is born out of student activism, and she's transitioned that into community organizing. Her work involves working across the very intricate linkages between the grassroots, the national, the regional, the global advocacy. And for the past 10 years, she's designed and led the implementation of dynamic multi-country projects and programs for adolescent girls and young women. She's worked for Femnet, Dandelion Kenya, the Global Partnership for Education, Nova Foundation, ICRW, Athena Network, IPASS, International Planned Parenthood Federation, Accountability International, Inroads, Youth Rise, among others. Catherine is a Mandela Fellow, a Women Deliver Young Leader, and a published author. So welcome to both Arby and Catherine, and I'm so glad you could join us today. There'll be discussants, and so after the presentation that I'll offer, I'll ask both of them to just chime in and share their insights, their perspectives, their feedback on kind of what has struck them in the presentation. And with that, so glad you're here, and let's launch right in. So I'm going to share my screen again, and here we go. Welcome as more people come. I'm glad you're here. So the big question for us is, what do we mean by changing the narrative? And when I say narrative, I'm actually speaking of a very specific thing, and it's what's below people's actions and their behavior. It's getting at people's motivations and how, frankly, they perceive the world. So when we say as a sector we want to change the narrative about what it means to do social good in the world, we're really thinking about shifting the consciousness and values of our supporters, not just getting them to give us money, right? So the narrative frame around a piece of content that we produce from an organization or institutional point of view can either reinforce that reader's perspective or challenge it. And we can do that without changing any of the facts of the story or the video we're producing. It basically means no one comes blank to how we communicate about our work. People come with their own ideas, values, perceptions. And the question for us is, what choices are we going to make that either reflect what's happening on the political rhetoric and in the education systems we're all a part of? Or are we going to encourage people to maybe think a little bit differently? Are we going to help people evolve from a charitable mindset, which unfortunately is hierarchical and allows for a lot of issues to arise, to global solidarity and what that means? And when we talk about shift the power in the social good sector, I think that requires new narrative frames. I don't think the old, the poor people over there that need our help doesn't work anymore for that. Doesn't work in our society anymore. So I will say that we want to encourage new interpretations of our work. I think that the narrative frames that exist around the social good sector are ones of our own creation, and ones that we've either bought into or just perpetuated. So we have an opportunity right now to actually create some new narrative frames. And for those of us who've been part of Shift the Power as an idea and a concept that's being shared within our sector right now, it means different things to different people. And I just want to take a pause in a moment to talk about that a little bit. Shift the Power could mean decentralized decision-making around resources, addressing privilege and power imbalances that are rooted in racism and imperialism. It could mean upholding self-determination and recognizing lived experience as expertise, one of my favorites. It could mean challenging notions of scale and of innovation and of what is small versus big. I think Shift the Power also means, in terms of communications, releasing the romanticism of changing the world. We need to get political and hold all of the hierarchies of power to account, whether in our institutions or in our governments or what have you. So here we are at this great moment to think differently together. Okay. So social good communications, and the way I perceive it and think about it, consists of three things. It has these narrative frames I've talked about. These are the operating assumptions held by the larger society. We've got our core messages. That's what we want to say. It's how we describe our work. And it's what we use actually to shift narrative. So it's not that we leave our core messages behind, but we need to understand them within a bigger picture of society's implicit understandings of doing good. And then we actually have the products or stories that communications professionals produce all day. And so these three things are working in tandem all the time. And often we just focus on the product. Once in a while, we'll spend some time on core messages. But I think this idea of what are the narrative frames, what are the ideas and perceptions that we need to shift over time is what we're talking about here today. Social good communications is also related to power. So I'm so happy and excited to see so many communicators in our sector here today because we either choose to uphold or challenge society's existing narrative frame. So writers and media makers have a tremendous amount of power in not just how we portray individuals, but how we frame our words, our images, our editing, our comparisons, even what stories we share can perpetuate society's stereotypes and what is occurring in the dominant culture. So, fortunately or unfortunately, these decisions create one version of events that often reflects how the media owner, us, the NGOs or the institutions, perceives reality. So either what we choose to emphasize or highlight reveals parts of ourselves, and we also reveals what's being left out of the narrative. And what is being left out of the narrative is often reflective of the power structures at play. So if it's time to get political about our work, which I think it is in the social good sector, with the climate crisis, increasing authoritarianism, rising inequality around the world, what do we have to lose at this point? So I'm gonna actually have us do an exercise together this afternoon, this evening, and talk a little bit and do some analysis around what are some of the narrative frames that exist around the social good sector. So I'm gonna give you a slide that's next. I'm gonna ask you to take a couple minutes and take a look at it, read it. It was written by, it's a draft blog, and the final version of the blog was written by a policy analyst working in an international campaigning organization. She was an MBA working on the chocolate supply chain campaign. And she had done some research for the campaign and was just writing her blog about that. And so on one side, on the left here, you'll see her version. And on the right side, you'll see the editor's version. And then I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to read it, absorb it. And then afterwards, I'll ask a couple reflection questions, and maybe we can have a little bit of discussion, either in the chat or out loud. So here we go. Welcome to those who are just joining. We're doing an exercise where we're looking at the first draft and the second draft of a blog. We're just making the comparisons and figuring out what's different about them. All right. Well, hopefully you've all had a chance to look over it at least once, and we'll come back to it. But I wanted to ask a couple questions to reflect together. So please feel free to unmute and share or chat your answers. I will also kindly remind everyone we are recording this today to share future series. So what narrative frames, which are the operating assumptions or the mental models held by the dominant society, what narrative frames were at play in this blog? Feel free to chat your answers or unmute and share. And what clues did you have about the author's perception of the power dynamics between herself and the cocoa farmers? I'm gonna stop the share so I can see the chat a bit. Welcome to everyone who's joined us. Glad you're all introducing yourself and very much. So Nana is talking about looking for handouts. Mickey says a lovely tourist destination. And also this perception that she's the star of the event. Yes, just the colorfulness. Any other observations about the narrative frames at use in that? There, Dee Dee says I versus them. A very deep sense of othering there, yeah. Yep, thanks, Christina. I think the desperate thing really hit me as well. People are looking to her for solutions. She's got there to listen. The presence of the person being a big deal. Absolutely. Absolutely. A little hint of that saviorism narrative, even if it's not overt, it's still relying on that assumption. Absolutely. There were no males preferred to come to the meeting. Yep. There's all kinds of dominant culture ideas happening in that draft. And yep. And definitely the folks at home, the people buying the chocolate are not part of this at all. Yeah. Yep. Not yet an analysis of the cause of the problem for sure. And that is a narrative frame that that I argue is large, very, very problematic in our sector, which is this idea that making a change is easy, that it's easy to make a difference. So yeah. Well, thank you for that. There's so much in it. Absolutely, the hero narrative, Giovanna. But so many different things are at play here that we're trying to do. And I'm gonna share again because I want to show you some of the edits as I saw them. And I have to make a full-on confession here. I was the editor of this blog. Hopefully that's not too surprising, but it's something I did years ago and tried to make it a bit better. So here's some of the changes I made and some of the things I observed that were problematic. The desperate to be heard was unacceptable. I could not leave that there. Bright smiles in the hopes that we had something to offer. Just the reinforcement of powerlessness there, which really denies partnership. It is reinforcing dependency. And I think what happened on the right side, which is definitely not perfect, and I definitely could have gone further, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. But I think we wanted to, first of all, offer some dignity about the people of the place. So not that specificity is actually, I think, a marker that supports a notion of dignity. You know, oftentimes the continent is thought of as one entity, and you know, people might not even know what Cote d'Ivoire is, but they definitely should even know the name of the village. I think our names are an important part of who we are. and added this idea that there's a supply chain. You are part of this. You are connected to these women as a consumer. And then tried to say the women were ready to be heard. The women play essential roles. And one question I always have is, for myself and for you all right now, is, did I go far enough? What else could have been done? I've also had important feedback on why reinforce the colorful pattern pagnes or cloth wraps. Why reinforce some of those things? But I have to say, one of the organizational barriers in this particular case is that by the time the blog had arrived to my hands as an editor, there was already a massive campaign developed. So by the time it got to me, all of a sudden there was just a mandate to publish a blog from this policy expert, and I had to work with what I had. Absolutely, I could have gone further. It would have also then required my intervention in terms of narrative frames much earlier, and also just to impact the story gathering itself, so that it wasn't a travel blog, and really showed an awareness of the power dynamics. So what are some of the narrative frames which we mentioned that are shaping the social good communications? We have the problem of poverty porn. We've all thought about it and talked about it. I wanted to go a little bit deeper and say what is behind that, that even gets people ready to accept that as acceptable, right? So I'm proposing are some of the below narrative frames, the stuff that really operates unconsciously below in our society, or consciously, depending on how you relate to it. It's happening. We've got the poor, which are often considered helpless, incapable, desperate, passive, right? These assumptions about who people are and what they need, and how people in wealthy countries can help them over there have been a part of our communications for far too long. And over there is far away, another reality. The other, benevolence, that quality of being well-meaning. As a critic of international aid, I have often been accused of, maligning the do-gooders. How dare I? And I stand strong in that, knowing that under the shadow of doing good, much is hidden. So I don't want helping as a cultural construct just to be seen as simple and easy, because what we're trying to address are underlying root causes of issues. And we need to start thinking of helping as hierarchical. All of these things here, the poor over there, the other, helping, benevolent helper, I think these are all remnants of hierarchy, violence, and domination that was needed to support colonization and imperialism. And the more my own education has continued around those things, I've sort of really seen the connections. Because the real nature of poverty and disease and conflict and injustice, it's tragic. It's heartbreaking. It's not devoid of stress. And so there is nothing uncomplicated or pure or moral about being poor. And yet we continue to push that out. So I just don't want to use these shorthands anymore. I don't think they're useful. I think charitable portrayals of helping conjure up victimhood in order to validate the assistance that's being given. And there is a growing awareness, I think that's why all of you are here today, knowing that we've got to stop these portrayals. They actually counteract what we're trying to do within our mission. So I want to say, I do want to acknowledge, however, that helpfulness is a marker of good character. We don't want to, it's celebrated in all cultures in different ways. And in my culture, which is white and Christian and based in the US, do-gooders are almost universally venerated in mainstream media. They gain approval, affection, favor. And we also now see, especially within marketing for corporations, people in corporations, the marketing teams in corporations are now using social good communications full on as their marketing strategy. So all of the things we've been doing are really being co-opted. So we need to think about new frames because we also have these things called interdependence and internationalism and anti-racism that deserve a really good hard think in our sector. And so I'm going to give you a couple quick tools to use in your work day to day, and then I'm going to hand over to my fellow speakers and we'll open up. So the first tool I'm offering is a quick guide to sniffing out poverty porn. And my former leader at Thousand Current, Salome Lema, came up with these questions years ago when we were working together before. Of course, we know poverty porn is the practice of depicting the graphic qualities of a vulnerable human being for the sole purpose of eliciting an emotional experience and ultimately money. So poverty porn, or even a romanticized picture of deeply rooted structural issues, why it's problematic is that it absolves people of privilege from their actual responsibility. And as for those of you who have just joined, we're really talking about when organizations reinforce notions of us versus them, or at least I'm doing something, or savior narratives, this overrides our key messages, and it also lowers expectations for our organization's impact. It's actually problematic in many ways. So here's how to sniff that out. Just 5 simple questions, put them by your desk, and think about them as you produce content. Who is speaking, for whom, about what, for what purpose, and what's missing? And here's the real kicker. If you share a lot of characteristics with the dominant culture, you might not know what's missing. And that's why it's really important we get more people from the global south onto our international NGO teams in real ways, with real responsibility. And we start to share power that way, especially in our communications teams, and probably particularly in our communications teams. And the other little guide I'm going to offer as we turn to discussion is the heads up, you may be weird statement. And I offer this because our own sector, we're very self-referential, but I really think that we're here because we want to make some waves in our sector, which itself is a product of inequality. So problematizing those narratives is important to bringing about the future we want to see. So we need to understand how the power of storytelling could enable people to see more of the world and be put in other people's shoes. And for those who are new as well, if we don't sort of challenge these narratives that exist, we're going to reinforce negative frames, and we're going to actually deepen people's ignorance. So weird, if you are Western and educated from industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, yeah, you're a very small percentage of the world's population. And yet, because we're associated with dominant culture, we think that the frames we use are the frames for everyone, and they're everyone's experience, and that's what we've got to always fight against, no matter what identities you hold. These things have influenced us. And so checking ourselves to see how weird is this perspective we're putting up in the world matters. Heads up is also something, a checklist that was an educational tool to help people that were doing kind of cross-border initiatives and working on injustice. And so we really got to understand the social and historical forces that connect us to each other. And right now, those are the heads up: homogeny, ethnocentrism, ahistoricism, depoliticization, salvationism, uncomplicated nature of change, and paternalism. All of these things are aspects of nonprofit communications that I think if we can expel, we're going to do better and better and better. So I'm going to stop and allow folks to offer their perspectives. Kindly, if I can ask folks to mute if you're listening right now. Here's our questions for today. 2 questions to chew on. Do you think it's possible to tell compelling stories about other people without oversimplifying, stereotyping, or trivializing to some extent? Why or why not? And really our question is, how can we highlight problems without prescribing solutions? Can we inspire action without eliciting pity or shame? Can readers and viewers be angry without judgment and obliged without guilt? And now I'm going to hand over to Arby, ask him to give some thoughts. Thanks, Arby.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Jennifer, for that really great presentation. I think it really sort of like highlights the key issues within our sector. And for me, you know, I think one of the biggest problems in communications in the international development humanitarian aid sector is the problem of the single narrative. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the TED Talk by the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and you can search it. It's gone viral really, and it's about the danger of a single story. That's a title, and I think this is reflected in the stuff that you've discussed. So, for example, in asking in the tool that you presented, it asks, you know, what is missing. And you also mentioned earlier about sort of like releasing the romanticism from the international development humanitarian aid sector. And it's because we as a sector have created this single narrative of, you know, simple solutions to simple problems given by sort of like, you know, white Westerners to the people in the global South. And I think this problem of the single narrative has come about mainly because we wanted quick wins, quick fundraising wins. This was, you know, this is an easy way to sort of like gain money. And a lot of NGOs, in fact, justify that by saying that, oh, well, we raise more money, we can do more to help people. But I think this has impact in two areas. First, I think this is an impact on the people themselves that are involved in the sector, both the aid workers and the recipients of aid, you know, because it propagates white saviorism, as you have discussed earlier. It robs people of their dignity, especially when they're portrayed in an undignified manner. And it undermines solidarity, in fact, because of this sort of like dynamic of someone powerful helping someone who doesn't have the capability as it's portrayed. But one thing that I think is also underemphasized and that is really key is that the single narrative has actual impact on the effectiveness of our programs. I think one concrete example of this has been outlined so clearly in the book by Pablo Yanguas, and it's called Why We Lie About Aid. And this is because, you know, today, I think a lot of governments and a lot of donors are so focused on measuring change and measuring, you know, the impact of the work that we've done, which can be a good thing to some extent. But as Jennifer said, aid and trying to sort of like bring about development and trying to implement humanitarian programs, that's messy. That is very political, and it's always complicated. But the government are so focused on sort of like simplifying this. And why is that? I also think that this is because the government and the donors are responsive to people. They respond to their taxpayers, but people are not aware of the complexities of, you know, bringing about development and, you know, supporting sort of like people in need. And that is because we ourselves as a sector have propagated these simple narratives. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot because of it. You know, the fundraising people create simple narratives, and then the programs people are now complaining why are sort of like donor requirements assuming that doing development projects are simple things. And I think, you know, even if it has quick wins, I think it has a longer detrimental impact. Not only does it make it make our own development programs worse for people, but it also diminishes trust from the public, and it diminishes that sort of like engagement from the public, and it then links back again to sort of like undermining solidarity. And so if I have to have 4 key things that I could say, I would say that, first, it's to change the narrative. The question is it possible to tell a story without eliciting guilt or without eliciting pity? And I think, yes, it is definitely possible. But one has to recognize that first, the audience has changed. The audience in the 80s and the 90s, where poverty porn was at its peak, that's not the audience anymore. We are, to a large extent, much more globalized world, and there's huge members of the diaspora also looking at these things, and people are reacting to that. And I think recognizing that the audience has changed is key. Second, if we are to elicit emotions, I think it's better to base it on shared experiences rather than guilt and pity. Making emotions, or trying to access emotions that are more universal, rather than othering. Third is, I think we have to start unpacking the complexities of our sector and communicating that to the public really well, instead of relying on simple, feel-good stories. And lastly, I think it's easy to, it's tempting to think that our communication pieces, whether it's sort of like a video or a social media post, is a one-off. But actually, it contributes to a longer-term narrative of the things we tell about our sector, but also of how we frame the problems of the world. And I think if we recognize that this, whatever we produce and we put out there, contributes to a longer-term sort of like narrative, then we can, think about how do we change the narrative, and how do we influence the norms. So those are my sort of like initial reflections.
Great, thank you so much, Harvey. It was really important ideas around the long-term nature. It's not just one social media post. There's actually, the narrative is built over time. It's sort of the amalgamation of all the things we put out into the world. So thinking through that, thank you so much. And I'll offer up a chance to ask questions of Arby or myself or our next speaker in just a minute. I'm going to now turn to Catherine Nyambura. I'm very happy to have her here and allow her to share her perspectives and insights. Welcome, Catherine. Catherine, are you there? Let's see if she can. Catherine, if you're there, on the left-hand bottom, there's the mute button. You could unmute yourself.
Hello.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Just a little glitch.
Sorry for the glitch. So I was reflecting earlier on, and I don't want to belabor some of the points that you and Abby have put forward, but I wanted to just think through how some of our communication and the beginning inception of all of how we frame development and aid is from a power perspective, where we need to first think of decolonizing development. For a long time, we start from a humanitarian, saving people who are hungry, saving people who are poor. And I think that whole entry point into decolonizing development. So we do have, for example, the face of aid workers is much more global, much more pale, much more white. So it's important for us to reflect on how we have more aid workers who look like the people we are working with, right? And who are the ones also at the front of telling those stories and representing the issues we are speaking about. So I find it, as a young Black African Kenyan woman, it takes a while before you are affirmed as an expert So currently, as a consultant, when you introduce yourself as an international development consultant, the assumption is you sitting on a panel to tell the human story. And I think the human story, I don't have to always be the one telling the human story, but I think there's importance of legitimacy as to who is the one who's telling the story. I also find words like the voiceless, which are, well, the next point I was going to make is intention. They're supposed to be well-meaning concepts, but I don't think anybody is voiceless. We have to think of structuralism, of how some of these things are structural concepts of erasure of narratives for a long time. And so we have to start revisiting what it means to reclaim people's voices, ensure they're the ones sitting at the table and having the same place in terms of shaping the agenda, contributing as experts. And this means that we have to start being okay with some of the experts alongside us not being the subjects of our stories, right? And I wanted to move to the next point of how some of these problematic concepts have been weaponized and formalized, for example. So the point of having a single story is because those working in development have been weaved into the mindset of you have to have indicators. They can only measure this one thing. And so the M&E is weaponized against to reflect how the aid colonial savior mentality just focuses on improving women's well-being, can only focus on economic empowerment and not political agency plus social agency. And so I think it's important for us to start looking at what feminist, inclusive M&E measuring of our results looks like, right? And also being okay with what indigenous knowledge looks like in terms of shifting up some of this. I think we have to have the discussions with the donors on the table, and at the same time reflecting on why we have these things in the first instance as measures of progress. We have a world that's currently failed by capitalism, neoliberalism, but is still stuck with things that are not working, and particularly regurgitating them in our development work. So I think for me, it's critical for us to look at the inception of some of the concepts we look at, to start affirming expertise as my second point in its diversity, and being intentional, but not just being intentional in output, but also in process. I think we always think of, but I meant well. Yes, but you didn't do it well. Those are two different things. So I think it's, or you didn't say it well. And what people end up with is how you made them feel, not what you meant, right? And so as communicators, we really have an impact, especially at the interface of how people feel. And so communicating properly with following through the right process is important. And I think finally, is just picking up on the complexity and how sometimes it means we have to step back and reflect on how it means to communicate concepts amongst each other and outside of each other, because some of this simplification just ends up reinforcing structural hierarchies, ends up reinforcing power imbalances, and so I think it's important to be focused on that. And then finally is to not have or adopt an apolitical and ahistorical perspective, which we often do, right? So we know that the global north, global south dichotomy is coming from a point of previously very contentious relationships between these particular countries. And so to constantly keep talking about the cocoa exporters, mostly global north companies, sometimes helping amplify some of these structural struggles in our communication helps for us to keep the frame bigger and not just focus on one issue. So I'm also curious to see how I think we can communicate without trivializing, stereotyping, and romanticizing, but it means we have to also agree on what a new set of agreeable concepts and principles are in this wave of communication, right? Because a lot of this means questioning what is normal as standards, questioning what tools of collecting data are, and also collecting what the voice of delivery is, and being okay with having a new face of storytellers, having a new way of doing things, and that may not always be easy, particularly with the onset of platforms like social media, where people are constantly bombarded with a lot of information, and that can always be complex. So I'm not belittling the complexity, but saying that it has to be embraced in all its full context. And thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Really excited to jump on some of the things that you've talked about as the series continues. The intentional process, not just product, is increasingly important for communications departments. And I think exactly what you're saying, the face of storytelling, representation matters. And how can we as communications departments stop producing content ourselves as privileged members of a communications team with a great salary and, well, maybe not so great, but a salary, and think very carefully about who is best positioned to tell the stories about the issues that we are here to address. So thank you for that. I'm also really excited about how we can think about what would be the agreeable principles behind sort of new communications. So I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got a couple to start, and then please feel free to unmute yourselves. This is our discussion time. So, okay, the first one. Giovanna talks about the meritocracy trap. And I'm going to try first to interpret what I think she means by that. And Giovanna, please feel free to weigh in if I've got it wrong. But I think it's a notion, a dominant culture notion related to poverty itself, that if you work hard and do the right things, go to college, you will be able to pull yourself out of poverty. Am I correct, Giovanna, in saying that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. In my context of the U.S., we call it the bootstrap narrative. Everyone is able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And unfortunately, it's simply not true. So the question you're asking, I think, is really, how do we begin to introduce the structural notions of why poverty exists to people who are still believing this other idea? And I think one of the important things we can do as people who are representing our work to the general public is to think about really specific examples of the obstacles that are put in front of people, and the things that sort of enable cycles of poverty to continue. That is not an easy thing to do, but I think this is where the specificity of storytelling can really help. I have an uncle who really believes the bootstrap narrative, and we have been round and round and round about it. And so I have tried everything with someone who really is firmly in that. And it's not an easy one to dislodge, because what happens is your reader or your listener or your viewer thinks their own success, because everyone reads that story and thinks about themselves. This is the thing. We've got to really understand how actually the thought process works when we're consuming stuff, the psychology behind reading new content. One of the things people are comparing that story or that idea to their own notions of self. And so if I tell Uncle Scott that it is actually people get caught in a poverty cycle and trap, it means that all of his hard work didn't matter. And that's simply not true either. There's a both and in this that we've got to think about together. Because people that are poor work incredibly hard and much harder, and especially the working poor in the US are working incredibly long hours, and capitalism continues to squeeze more people out. So I don't have a great answer. I know that it's a discussion that we can and should continue to talk about in our organizations. Not in the same way of like, oh, poor so-and-so, but, oh, this person is trying all of these things to get out of poverty. And this is the aspirations they have for their family. And let that be the link between Uncle Scott, so that he can see that person as someone who also works very hard, just like him. And, you've got to establish a shared value first, and then you can have a more contentious conversation. That's what I've learned a lot post elections in the US. So that's a long explanation, but something to talk about.
Thank you.
for us to talk about more. Thanks.
I
We've
was
got, please, Arby, go ahead.
Yeah, I was hoping to sort of like answer that as well, actually. So the question is, how can we tell sort of like a compelling story without using such narratives? And I think when you think, as individuals, if we think about the novels or the stories that we like, they're not simple stories. We're attracted to the complexity and the compellingness of the stories, and the compellingness is precisely out of that complexity, right? And I think this links to another comment here below, which says, when we come up with sorry, not that one, but something along the lines of, here from Christina, who says, capitalism and neoliberalism has failed, but also listeners who are the donors and the general public closed down when we could get close to the underlying issues. But I think the beauty, for example, of Les Miserables as sort of like literature and as a musical is that it goes into the root of the problem without explicitly saying, well, look at the unfair justice system, or look at the dynamics of poverty where you can fall under a trap and then it's harder to come out. These stories are so good because they get to the heart of the problem without being jargony or being very preachy, or it touches the right emotions in people. So I think that's exactly why we need to tell good stories, so that we don't fall into these traps. And I think maybe the sector has to be more creative in telling these stories. I mean, I know it's not uncommon for sort of like particularly believers of sort of like free market and neoliberal economics to, for example, sponsor movies that reinforce those ideas. So maybe we should be thinking in the aid sector, maybe you should move away from sort of like 30-second ads and think about more ambitious things like movies or novels that can help really change the narrative.
And I also think it's beyond. I think sometimes we have part of us rethinking communication is also starting to challenge the power hierarchies in development, right? A lot of what we do is donor set agendas, right? And I think we have seen instances where donors are stepping in to fund agendas set by others. And that's more of what people should be demanding. For a long time, we just have this program set by and not necessarily following the money, but also making those the money accountable. They too are governments. And I think centering people in development is what it should be about. And a few spaces have been able to do that in small instances, but visibilizing what that looks like and ensuring more donors respond to that is important. Because I think we have accepted the hierarchy of donors are here, and all of us accept that we have this funding that's set like this. But we have donors who are giving core flexible funding that's not just focused on ensuring that this project is done this certain way. So we have to start demanding better. The way we are calling out neoliberalism and capitalism for not working. It's the same way we have to start saying that, look, the way we've done development for a long time has been affirming and reaffirming problematic hierarchies. And so if we say it often enough and we think of clear, as Abby says, clear alternative system, for a while, we will normalize those. And somebody, I think, has to start thinking and normalizing what that looks like. And then it may not be done in maybe 5 years, but seeding the change sometimes is what needs to be the starting point, if you ask me. So yes, we can do it, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm inspired by many organizations. Someone's asked for, what are the organizations that are doing things differently? Who can we look to? I want to ask both of you that question. Who are the organizations you think that are dare I say, innovating?
So I sort of like posted about this talk on Twitter, inviting people to join, and somebody, Ben Ramalingam, who is a sort of like a researcher and academic at the International Institute for Development Studies, he sent me a link to a blog that he wrote about his own reaction to seeing an ad from War Child. I don't know much about the organization in general and in terms of their sort of the communications, but from this particular example, it was basically a video in a refugee camp, and then the the child was sort of like being carried by Batman, and they were sort of like playing around sort of like the refugee camp, and at the end of the video, the Batman transforms into his dad, and it plays on that sort of like connection of like with the father and the fantasy of sort of like escaping a hard situation. And Ben, apparently, he grew up in a conflict setting as well, and he was just reminded of that. And I think this, and I agree with him on how he says that this is a good example, because it plays again on a shared sort of like universal experience of using escapism as a child to escape something that's really hard. And it also shows the strengths, not the vulnerabilities, but the strengths of the dad and the son within this hard setting. So I think there are many, I'm sure, out there, good examples, not nearly enough, I guess. Another organization that I was thinking of is Give Directly. And I think I like them for their honesty in terms of their failure. They're not a perfect organization by all means, and I've seen a few communications from them that may be subject to the same critiques as we've talked about earlier. But I think something that the sector can learn from them is their honesty about failure and how they're learning from it, and not just putting out manicured statements of, oh, we're so successful and we've done this and this is what we've accomplished.
Yeah, great. Catherine, do you have any good examples to point people to?
I think I was reflecting on organizations such as, Global Fund for Women, who, even though they are a donor, they really work with their constituency to set their agenda and, share power. Think of funding that is focused on supporting the actual work and not just projectizing, development. And I think there's a few others like those, Novo Foundation, among others. Yeah. I don't want to speak about many, but I think there are people I have engaged with that didn't box you into, you just focus on this project and come back with results. And I guess that for me shows that there is a lot more people who are reflecting on their power, reflecting on their position, reflecting on how they interface with those they are working with in meaningful ways, and think of how do we recreate this narrative. And I think for me, Global Fund for Women does a good job of communicating complex concepts while still making them easy to internalize. And I think that's what most people are like, no, but you have to make it simple, but don't oversimplify it, right? I think it's a delicate balance that we are all struggling with, but there are a few examples out there to look out for.
Yeah. And I think we can, Frida is a great example of an organization looking to young female artists who are helping to portray that. Because what we are talking about is complex, and yet artists are the best at making things accessible. So for all of you who are communicators on the phone, tapping back into your own sense of creativity and how you bring that to the work is going to be really important for how we take these new narratives forward. I'm very aware that we are at the hour, and I acknowledge there's questions we haven't yet touched. That's why this is a dialogue series, not a one-off. I think this is a long, very long conversation for all of us to keep having together. And I just want to offer up some quick ending thoughts and really give us the contact information of everybody here today so we can keep the conversation going. Here we go. These are, when we met together as the Shift the Power symposium a couple weeks ago in London, these are some of the things we talked about in particular for the sector, but I think we can use them to also as touch points for shifting the power in our social good communications. One is to be political, one is to be accountable, inclusive, here's the thing about the creativity we're going to keep coming back to. Be experimental, be braver, and check your own power. I want to thank our speakers today. They're on Twitter here. You can find them and follow their incredible work, both of them, and many other links here, and as well as my own email, should you need anything. I really feel like painting a fuller picture of people's lives in this very rapidly changing world that we're a part of is becoming a part of everyone's job, not just the communications team. It is actually central to fighting poverty and inequality. And, you know, the work that sometimes needed to bring about change is not sexy. It's not new. It's not innovative. But it's about citizens demanding their fundamental rights. It's about governments managing their budgets. It's about the day-to-day grind of making institutions function. And so let's just share that reality. And just as it takes time for crops to grow, it takes time to see results. Changing the world is no easy undertaking, but how can we prepare our viewers, our readers for that journey? How do we invite our supporter base along with us instead of seeing them as just an ATM? That's really our mandate going forward. So thank you. Please keep the conversation going. On Twitter, you can use Shift the Power. And I also want to say it is Giving Tuesday. You are, no matter where you are, what organization you work for, it's time. It's a great moment to open up these conversations internally. And I want to share this blog I wrote last year in the chat about how to really engage your director of communications if you do see these problematic frames coming up. It's important for everyone within organizations to think differently about how we communicate our work. So thank you for being with us today. Thanks again to Arby, Catherine, and to Wendy, who's been managing the chat. And please reach out with your continued questions and enthusiasm. We're going to figure this out together. And thank you so much. Take good care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Jennifer.